a couple of topics, but one which is quite close to my own heart. And those of you who've been with this series since the beginning may recall a discussion that I led and also had with another guest about the issue of campus anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, something that a few years ago, or I'm lying, many years ago, I was dealing with as a young student in the UK, and is still something that occupies me a great deal. And we're very fortunate to have with us today really what I think one of the leading lights in the campus war, if you like, in the United States, Ophir Dayan, who is actually from Israel, despite studying in the US. She was born and raised in Male Shomron, which is a small community in Shomron, in Samaria. She was an instructor, head of branch, and full-time volunteer for the Beitar youth movement. We're also going to talk about that. She served as an officer in field positions in the IDF spokesperson's unit and was awarded by the IDF head of operation for her role during Operation Protective Edge. She studied for a BA in international politics at Columbia University and is currently an MA student for international security policy, also at Columbia. And there she spearheads the fight for Israel at one of the most anti-Israel universities in the United States, unfortunately, as part of Students Supporting Israel, an organization which I wholeheartedly endorse. I've had the pleasure of speaking to them myself on 2 or 3 occasions. Ophir is also active with Students for the Temple Mount, which is maybe something we'll also touch on, as I don't know enough about that. Okay, Ophir, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. And before we start, I just want to give a shout out to Chuck Waxman, who's here on the call, a Beitari from New York. I had the privilege of meeting during my time in New York, so I'm glad to see you here. And let's get started. Great.
Welcome, Chuck. We actually had, last week, our topic was Jabotinsky. So it's quite a nice follow-on to have sort of go from the original Rosh Beitar to a Beitarit like yourself. Let's start with a question about what you're doing, about the sort of tachlis of what you're doing right now. So you're at Columbia. Now, I know, maybe some others on the call know, your father was the consul general in New York, which kind of explains why you were in New York. But can you say a little bit about how and why you ended up studying at Columbia rather than maybe, I don't know, studying here in Israel, and what you found there in terms of the anti-Israel atmosphere, and what you've done, how you've gone about fighting it.
So so as you said, my dad served as Israel's consul general in New York, and at some point I was, as you said in your introduction earlier, I was an officer in the IDF spokesperson unit, and at some point during my service I had to decide if I'm staying for a few more years or not. And in one of my discussions with my dad, the idea of attending college in the United States came up, and I have to say, I grew up in Male Shomron, in a small community in the Samaria. I never knew anyone who studied abroad, let alone in an Ivy League university. It was never, an ideal of mine. I never aspired to study abroad, and I never wanted to live abroad. I still don't. But when I started thinking about that, I looked at Columbia. It's the only college I applied to. Because of 2 reasons. The first one is obviously the academic side. Columbia is a great university, ranked number 6 in the world. But not more important than that, the fact that I knew Columbia has an anti-Semitism and anti-Israel issue. I did not know that it had an anti-Semitism issue at that point. I knew it had only an anti-Israel problem. I soon came to learn that you can't really separate the two. But I knew that Columbia had a really big problem with how Israel is perceived on campus. And I thought that, after 3.5 years in the spokesperson unit, and after, more importantly, 13 years in Beitar, I had a lot to contribute in that fight. And I think I don't want to, overestimate my contribution, but I think I was right. I think that on many occasions, simply having someone who's Israeli present at the conversation changes a lot. First of all, for the Jewish and pro-Israel students who a lot of the times don't really understand or are not familiar with the nuances, but also because someone who experienced these things and lived in Israel can provide a perspective that can't be provided by someone who never lived in Israel. So that's how I got to Colombia. I will say a bit about SSI. When I arrived to Colombia, before arriving to Colombia, I looked at a few of the pro-Israel organizations on campus. We're all friends here because it's the Begin Center, so I'll be completely honest with you. I went to the Hillel at Columbia before, between getting admitted and when I started attending Columbia. And one of the reasons I chose not to join the Hillel, there are a few reasons. First of all, that all the movements inside the Hillel are pro two-state solution, which is something that to me was quite problematic coming from a small settlement in the Samaria. One of them is J Street and the other one is Aria, which their motto is advocating a two-state solution. They're kind of like an APAC advocacy group for the two-state solution. It's not how I imagine spending my college career advocating for Israel. And the second reason is that Hillel at Columbia has a very nasty habit of hosting Breaking the Silence every single semester. And for me, hosting Breaking the Silence is a red line. I don't think you can be a true pro-Israel organization if you open your doors to people who slander IDF soldiers. And then I found SSI. For me, the moment in which Dalia, who is president of SSI Colombia before me, we had mutual friends on Facebook, and they sent her my post that I got admitted to Colombia. She reached out to me, and for me, that moment changed my life. I know it's
Ophir, just to remind everyone, because I only said it once in the beginning.
Students supporting Israel.
Students supporting Israel.
Yeah. So that moment really changed my life. In ways that I don't think I even can grasp all of them. SSI, I'll just give you a brief overview. It's a non-Jewish, non-partisan organization, which means we have Jews and non-Jews. I believe we will talk about it later on, but it's Jews and non-Jews, left and right, people who their common denominator is that they believe the Jewish people have a right to self-determination in their homeland.
Right. So these unlike the organizations that you didn't want to join because they were pro two-state solution, this isn't SSI is not an organization that takes a line necessarily against two-state solution. It just doesn't take a position.
Right. I would even go limber and say that I think most of the people in my organization believe in the two-state solution. That's fine. But as an organization, we don't advocate for one state, two state, three states, 1,000, a confederacy. Like, it's not something we do. Unfortunately, and the reason we don't do that, and I think that's something, that is perhaps one of the most important takeaways you can take from this conversation, is that at campuses like Columbia, who are, extremely progressive and extremely identified with the far left of US politics, when we're talking about Israel, we're not talking about 67. We're not talking about a 6-day war. We're not talking about settlements. We're talking about 48. We're talking about the right of the Jewish people to have a Jewish state. And when that is the question about Israel on campus, I really don't believe that we have the privilege to start dividing ourselves to Jews against non-Jews and left against right. First of all, we need to all work together and establish the understanding that, yes, like all people, Jews have a right to self-determination in their homeland. Once this is 100% clear, then we can move on and start dividing ourselves to two states, one state, whatever people, whatever solution they have in mind.
Great. Okay, so we'll definitely go more into the specifics of your work there. I wanted to also ask though a little bit about your background. So you mentioned obviously coming from the IDF and what you were doing in the IDF, where you were won an award for your work. But also very influential, clearly, is both your time in Beitar as an instructor and head of a SNF, head of a branch, and as a full-time volunteer. And also, of course, where you grew up, which, as you said, was not, you didn't grow up in Tel Aviv or Yerushalayim, right? You grew up in a small settlement, a small community over the Green Line. And I assume that also had some impact on the way you think about things. Can you say a little bit about both of those aspects, both the way you grew up and also Beitar?
Yeah, I'll start with where I grew up. Look, growing up in a place like Ma'ale Shamron, you wake up every morning and you know that you live in that place not just because it's a pretty place, and it is. It's a beautiful community and the view is amazing and the nature is amazing. But the reason that you live there is not because of that. It's not because the housing is cheap. And you wake up every morning knowing that there's a true meaning to the fact that you woke up this morning in your bed in Ma'ale Shamron and not in another bed in Tel Aviv. You know that by waking up in my bed in Ma'ale Shamron every single morning, hearing the sound of birds on my window, I know that I'm doing something. And it might seem to some of you a little ridiculous that I'm saying it, but to me, ever since I was a kid, I would wake up every morning knowing that I'm doing something great for the Jewish people, that I am in a place where I'm needed. That if me and my family are not there, someone else would be there, and that someone else might shoot rockets at Ben Gurion Airport, which is 35 minutes drive from my house, or at Kfar Saba, which is 15 minutes drive from my house. I will tell you more than that. Look, my parents, Dani and Einat, I believe they're on this call. They, I'll be completely honest. If Judea and Samaria was not a necessity, I don't think they would live there. They love the opera. They love going to shows, to plays, to cafes, to great restaurants. I believe that in terms of lifestyle, they would much rather live in Tel Aviv, but they don't. They live in Ma'ale Shamron since the 80s because they understand it's of prime importance to the Jewish people. And this is something I really admire my parents because of, and hopefully I'll be doing the same thing when I grow up and have my own family. Beitar, first of all, I grew up in Beitar. First of all, Beitar is the only youth movement in my community. My community was established by Beitar, by Mishkei Cherut Beitar. So it is very active in my community.
Is it a wholly secular community?
No. So my community, by ideal, is a mixed community, which means that it maintains, ideally, a 50-50 proportion of religious and non-religious Jews, which I found amazing growing up. I went to a religious, kindergarten, and I knew all the prayers by heart. I cannot remember them now, but I remember finding it very meaningful. My friends growing up were mostly religious people, and it taught me a lot. I today fast 4 times a year because I feel connected to Judaism and I feel connected to my heritage, although I'm not a religious individual. But going back to Beitar, for me, Beitar was not just for many kids my age. It was just a way to spend the afternoon. For me, it was something very deep. I got very lucky to be born to a family where I'm a 5th generation Beitaria from both sides. I think it's pretty rare, and I'm privileged, and it's an extreme honor to grow up in such a family. So the ideas of Beitar were never, something I only learned in the Maoz, in the Beitar branch in my community. It's something that I lived by in my house. I mean, my grandparents on my dad's side met in the revisionist movement back in Argentina. This is something I grew up believing. And at Columbia, if we take it to the present, this set of ideas is something that is constantly challenged by everyone around me, whether it be Jabotinsky's ideas about the economy, about racial justice, about well, people don't really know Jabotinsky's ideas about racial justice, but I highly recommend reading them. I think it's extremely interesting, and we can get to it later, but it gives me a lot of talking points on campus, because this is something, it's his idea on racial justice and on feminism and women's equality is, I think one of the most progressive writers and thinkers of his time. But for me, this is something I always lived by, and coming to Columbia and being challenged all the time, something that I found very meaningful, because I always had something to refer back to, and I always had to challenge myself and think, why do I believe in these things? Is it just because I grew up this way, or because it really makes sense to me? And I'm glad to report it 3 years later, I'm pretty sure I still believe that, and not because I grew up this way. But yeah, it definitely had a lot of influence on the way I'm doing things and on the reasons I'm doing them.
Right. Yeah, I think it's. I think to some extent, I feel like anyone who goes into the student battle on behalf of Israel, having had experience in a Zionist youth movement, I think comes with something extra. But I mean, I didn't grow up in Beitar, but I work at the Bacon Center, and I'm reasonably well acquainted these days with Jabotinsky and his ideas, and I'm a personal strong admirer of them, and I think that they do. I completely agree with you. I think they have a lot to add to the debate on all these issues, and present a kind of liberal, like to especially in America, right, with the emphasis in sort of American students, the emphasis on quote unquote liberal values. And Jabotinsky was this quintessential liberal, but he was a liberal nationalist, right? He was a liberal Zionist, and I think that's hugely powerful. I want to just go back to what you said when you were talking about this this kind of approach that you really like with students supporting Israel, where it's a mix of people, left wing, right wing, not just Jews, and I was struck that I think it wouldn't be obvious necessarily to someone if someone hadn't heard you or met you. They said, okay, there's this Israeli from the Shtachim, from the West Bank, right, who's studying in an American university, and she's active in student politics. I think there would be firstly, people would make all kinds of assumptions which aren't true. One, that you would be religious, which you've already said you're not, but then there's that kind of misconception about.
Oh, you're so great. Even the people I served with in the IDF spokesperson unit assumed it was.
I can completely believe that. But also, I think they would assume that, okay, she's going to come with a very sort of not only her own fixed views, but she's not going to want to work with anyone that doesn't share those views. And I think there's something very powerful about the kind of what I would call sort of big tent approach that you're adopting there. And I wonder, can you say something about why that speaks to you so much? So I mean, for example, you mentioned that the alternative to SSI were these avowedly left-wing alternatives. But I wonder if there had been a strict right-wing alternative, would that have appealed to you more than SSI, or would you prefer the SSI approach? And can you tell me why, if that's
so? I think I touched on it a bit before, but I think it's a really important issue to understand. On my campus, the issue is 48. It's not 67. When the issue is 48, you need to answer what you're asked. You need to answer why 48. And a left-wing or a right-wing group does not answer that question. Left-wing group or right-wing group answers 67. They don't answer 48. Only a group that combines people from all different backgrounds, from all different religious beliefs, from all different political ideologies can answer 48, because 48 was not a moment in history where right-wing or left-wing people established a nation for right-wing or left-wing Zionists. 48 was a moment where the Jewish people came together and reestablished a sovereign state for the Jewish people. The reason it's so important to me, and then one could say, you know what, you can take, right-wing Jewish activists and left-wing Jewish activists, and that would be enough. Why do you go and try and bring in people who are not Jewish? And when I'm tackled with this question, I think there's two really important aspects to the answer. The first one is that Zionism is the most just cause today on college campuses, and generally, in my opinion. Let me briefly mention, how I approach Zionism and how I define it on campus, and how I tell the story of the Jewish people on campus. So when I need to talk to people who are not necessarily familiar with the story of Israel and do not share, the views of Zionism, I present it this way. Imagine an indigenous population that lived in their own lands for thousands of years, and all of a sudden a colonial power came to that land and expelled them. And 2,000 years of since the moment of expulsion, they were subjected to genocide at the worst moments, but also discrimination, harassment, violence. And after 2,000 years of experiencing all that, they managed to liberate themselves and reestablish a sovereign nation. I don't know anything more progressive and more just than that. And if this is the most progressive and just cause, it can be advocated for just by Jews. Because if it's just, period. It's not just for Jews, it's just for everyone. So that's one element. But the second element, which is not less important, or maybe it is, but it's also very important in my opinion, is that Zionism is the only truly successful national liberation movement to date. Think about it. I don't know many other nations who managed to liberate themselves in this way. So because we are so successful, we have the moral obligation to teach others, to help others who are not as successful achieve the same goal. And that's the two main reasons that my activism always includes non-Jews.
Okay, that's a great answer. That's a great answer. I want to, this is going to be my last question, and then I want to get some questions from the audience. So please get writing, everyone. So I'm going to finish with a bit of a, maybe it's a tough one, I don't know, you'll tell me. So at the beginning you mentioned one of the red lines for you was the invitation to breaking the silence. So clearly you have red lines, which I think is important. Everyone should have red lines. But I guess in the sort of big tent that we're talking about, where's the line? Like, who's out? For example, I mean, my guess is that different people would put the line at a different place, right? So some people would say J Street are out, some would say J Street are in, some would say, I don't know, some would say break the silence, right? I mean, J Street probably, but where's the line? And do you have in your own mind, do you have a sense of what's the criteria? What boxes do people have to check in order to be part of the big tent?
So for me to be a part of SSI, the only thing you need, and it's a pretty basic thing, but unfortunately not an obvious one in 2020, is believing that the Jewish people have a right to self-determination in their homeland. That's what you need, in my opinion, to be a part of SSI. Having said that, I understand that breaking the silence might believe that. The reason I put the red line at breaking the silence is not because I think they're all horrible people. I don't know them personally, not all of them at least, but because I think they, the way they are advocating what they believe is very problematic in the way that instead of, I have no problem with criticizing Israel. I have a lot of criticisms of Israel and the Israeli government myself. But I think there's a distinction to be made between criticizing Israeli governments and policies and only criticizing Israeli governments and policies. I don't think, and based on what I've seen in many breaking the silence events I went to at Columbia, unfortunately they're popular at Columbia, they never say, you know, we love Israel, this is what we do because we love Israel. Israel has some really great things that they're doing, but we have a problem with the so-called occupation. That's not what they're saying. They're coming to campus and they're aligning with Israel's worst enemies. They're aligning with Students for Justice in Palestine. They're aligning with Jewish Voice for Peace. They're aligning with different groups in Columbia Law School and in Columbia School of International Affairs, groups that definitely have no interest in doing anything good for Israel, groups that loudly claim that they would like to erase Israel off the map, and they cooperate with these groups and give them tools to fight Israel. For me, this is a red line. Even if personally as individuals, they would define themselves as Zionists and they would think that that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. In the end of the day, they are partnering with Israel's enemies in this battlefield of college campuses and are doing damages that are sometimes beyond repair.
Okay. Thank you very much. That makes a lot of sense. I'm assuming that everyone, or I maybe mistakenly assumed that everyone on this call knows who Breaking the Silence are and what Breaking the Silence are. Anyone that doesn't, in brief, and Ophir will correct me if I miss anything out here, but essentially a group that an Israeli group that go around university campuses and other places outside Israel, essentially exposing so-called or alleged deeds by Israeli soldiers in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank, and that's essentially their hence the silence that they are allegedly breaking is the silence of bad things that the IDF do. That's their agenda. But as
been caught lying many times.
Yeah, right. So there's definitely there's certainly a lot of evidence that think that what they say is at best unsubstantiated, and yeah, lying I think is a fair description of much of it. And also, of course, I think it's important to say that one of the criticisms given is that they're not, at least in large part, they're not giving this critique to Israelis, right? They're making a point of going abroad and doing it in English, and essentially whipping up anti-Israel sentiment, often in places which don't even need that.
No, they definitely don't.
For example, Columbia University. Okay, we have a question here from Doug Altabef. I hope I pronounced that right. Who's the board chairman of Im Tirtzu, Israel's largest campus-oriented Zionist organization, and he's also an alumnus of Columbia. He says, I've met with several SSI activists, including in Columbia. Much of what has characterized pro-Israel in the US, as students there have explained to me, has been a defensiveness, a feeling that Israel has to be accounted for and rationalized. It has been when the SJP, that's Students for Justice for Palestine, types are exposed as liars when the fight is taken to them, that there is greater effectiveness. Would Ophir please comment on this?
Yes, I think one of the big faults of the pro-Israel community in the United States over the past few years has been exactly that. I'll give an example from Columbia. Students supporting Israel at Columbia started only a few years ago. What started before Students supporting Israel at Columbia is Apartheid Week. Apartheid Week is a week in which Students for Justice in Palestine put up a huge wall in the middle of campus claiming that Israel is practicing apartheid policies. And they indoctrinate and lie about Israel for a complete week. Before students supporting Israel arrived on campus, what was done during that week is, you guessed it, putting on your helmets, hiding inside the Hillel and doing nothing, because protesting that week would only anger them more and whatever. In my view, obviously SSI's view, that's not a solution. There's two reasons why it's not a solution. The first reason is that it sends the wrong message to Jewish and pro-Israel students. It's sending the message that instead of fighting, we should all just hide. And the second reason, and the most important one, is that apartheid week is anti-Semitism, okay? And anti-Semitism doesn't just go away if you hide. You need to fight it. And that's what SSI has been doing for the past few years since we started at Columbia. Every semester, in the spring semester, it's the same time as Apartheid Week. Fall semester does not have an Apartheid Week, so we do it on our own. We have a week called the Hebrew Liberation Week. It's a week where we put huge displays on campus and table for an entire week, talking to as many people as we can, explaining about Israel, the Jewish people, the connection of the Jewish people to the state of Israel, and to the land of Israel, obviously. And I find that SSI takes a more activist approach to advocacy on campus. Instead of talking only about Ways and cherry tomatoes, which are great inventions, we try to talk more about our right to the land of Israel, and then, but why we are here, and then how we came to develop cherry tomatoes, which is great. But first of all, we need to understand why we're here and why these cherry tomatoes were developed in Israel, not in Uganda. That's the first thing that we do. And the second thing that we do, I think that other groups are kind of reluctant to do, we attend all the anti-Israel events and lectures at Columbia. So if a student group is having an event that is anti-Israel, we go. If a professor is giving an anti-Israel lecture, we go. Well, we don't just go to listen. We go and we write our notes, and then during the Q&A, we expose their lies and we challenge them with difficult questions. Obviously not for the people who are anti-Israel. I don't think Professor Rashid Khalidi would hear my question and go with me to the Temple Mount. I think that for the benefit of the few people sitting in the room who do not have yet a formed opinion about Israel, it is important that I ask this question and trigger them to think about different points of view and about perhaps exposing the truth behind what Rashid Khalidi is saying. Hope that answered the question. Great,
thank you. There was actually a question, a specific question about SSI, mm-hmm. and you've kind of partly answered that, I think, about what you do there. But there was one question about how large is SSI? Is it a big organization? How large is it how large is it? The question actually asked how large is it at Columbia, but maybe you can answer that and also nationally.
Okay, so I'll give a brief overview of SSI. It was started in 2008 in Minnesota, in the University of Minnesota, by a brother and sister, Israeli brother and sister who studied in the University of Minnesota. Today, it has 50 chapters across the US, Canada, Mexico, and Argentina. And looking at new places, if you know students in other places who would like to open SSI chapters, please let me know. I will link my email and contact info later in the chat. At Columbia, we currently have 9 board members and roughly about 50 to 70 activists. It's kind of hard to measure because, students come and go. But I would say roughly 50 to 70 activists and 9 board members.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so we're getting a whole slew of questions now. Very nice. What do you do about Jewish American students who don't have a clue? And there's a reference here to Seth Rogen, the famous Seth Rogen comments. But there is this kind of sense that there's a large number of Jewish American students who aren't anti-Israel. They just really don't know anything about it.
Right. I'll tell you more than that. There is even a large population, well, not large, but a significant population of American Jews who are not just pro-Israel. They want to be vocal about it. On campuses, most pro-Israel students don't want to be vocal about it. But there is a significant population of young American Jews who want to be very vocal, but they don't know what to say. They even grew up in very Zionist homes, but everything they know about Israel is, let's ride a camel up to Masada at 5 a.m. and then we're gonna go to a Bedouin tent and eat lafa with labane, and then we're gonna go to the Western Wall, leave a note, and Israel is the greatest country on earth, and let's go back to JFK. That's it's very, it's a very simplistic way to describe it, but I came across a lot of people who have good intentions. They love Israel, but that's all they know. And then when they come on campus and they hear Israel is an apartheid state, one of two things happen. One of three. Either they become anti-Israel because they say, okay, I know about ways, but they're saying apartheid, and that's a stronger argument. That's the first unfortunate issue. The second option is for them to just decide to be silent and be pro-Israel, but never mention it out loud. And the third option is people who want to learn. And these people are the people that we try to reach out to. Obviously, we also try to reach out to the other two groups before it's too late, but it's not always very easy. What we do in SSI is that we have weekly training sessions for our activists. We call them ambassadors. And every week we give them a lecture about a different topic. It can be something like how to debate. And it can be this week's lecture I'm giving on Thursday, 2 a.m. Israel time, if you're interested, 7 a.m. New York time, about Judea and Samaria. Next week, my vice president is giving a talk about Jews of color. And every week we give them a lecture that is supposed to give them tools to be able to address these things on campus. Obviously, the events that we're having that are open to the public are also a great source of information for them. And obviously personal interactions. Each board member of mine, including myself, we have a deputy. So this is an activist who we see a lot of potential in, someone who is not necessarily very knowledgeable, but wants to do good for Israel, and we train them individually throughout the year. So we have all these different opportunities for young American Jews and not young American Jews, just people who are pro-Israel and don't have enough tools to learn. In addition, obviously, there are in normal times, there are conferences like the IAC and the JNF and other organizations and internships and other opportunities that we offer our members to learn more.
Great, thank you. And if you're not anyone, and if people are not awake 2 a.m. to see this kind of thing live, I should say that I think on the website of SSI there's some videos,
right?
Videos, including one that you did about Judea and Samaria.
They're very similar.
Right. So
spoiler alert.
That's on the website. I think it's the same. I think it's the same series that I spoke at like a while ago.
Right. The SSI webinar series.
Right.
Last semester.
Okay. So there were a couple of questions specifically about Columbia. I'll combine them maybe. So there was one question about this. So there's one from a gentleman called Mark Goldberg, who's an alumnus of the School of Social Work at Columbia. And he says that he sent a letter to the dean after reading about your experiences in the press. He sent a letter to the dean challenging the silence of the school in the face of anti-Semitism on campus. And he wanted to know if letters like that and those kinds of complaints actually do anything or help.
Yes.
Okay, just a second. And the second question, which is a more general question from Marcel Danon, who's a good friend of us here at the Begin Center, and also Beitari, he asked about what proportion of Jewish students at Columbia identify with SSI, and does SSI have any real support from the authorities at Columbia?
Okay,
both of those.
Two really good questions. So first of all, Columbia is a private institution, which means it is very much dependent on donations, which means they're very sensitive to these kind of letters of alumni and possible donors. You can just ask my mom how many emails a week she gets from my dean asking her to donate money. And I'm still a student at Columbia. I still pay them tuition. I'm not at the donating part yet. So they are very sensitive to these kinds of letters. They're also very sensitive to the press, which is something I learned in the last 3 years. And learn to utilize against the you know, let's say Columbia is not very happy about it, but they're very sensitive to alumni letters and donors and press. They're very, very, very attentive to that. So that's about that. And the second question was about.
Firstly, what proportion of Jewish students at Columbia identify with SSI, okay. And does the organization have any support?
Yeah. Great question. So I'll address it. I'll start more broadly. So if I had to say overall how the pro-Israel, anti-Israel camp at Columbia is divided, so I would say 20% of Columbia students are extremely anti-Israel. Most of them are very vocal. Then you have 10% who are pro-Israel. We'll get to them in a second. And then 70% who have no clue or no formed opinion, which these are a target audience. But you probably heard that many times from other people. The 10% who are pro-Israel, unfortunately, I would say that 85% of them would never say out loud that they're pro-Israel because they don't want to be marked down in class. They don't want to be marginalized by their friends. So they would never say that in person or out loud. Out of the 15% of the 10% that we have left, I'm sorry for doing a statistics class, I would say that most of them are active in either SSI or ARIA. ARIA is the Pro Two-State Solution advocacy group. Some people are active in both. But I would say a larger proportion is a part of SSI because ARIA is just more internal inside the Hillel. But I would say more people are in SSI and they're certainly heard more. We're more vocal.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to combine another couple of questions here, which I am I'm making an assumption that we can connect them, and it might be that you'll tell me that they're not connected or they're not based on the same thing. But there was a question about from Sandy, sorry Sandy, I don't have your last name, who graduated from Columbia in 1962. And Sandy says that at that time there was no anti-Semitism on campus and wants to know when it all changed, in your view. And the second question was that whether you found that the what we're now calling the woke culture in the United States finds that Israel does not fit their narrative. And I'm sort of throwing the third question, linking the two, which is whether that sort of woke, or let's say previously kind of hard left culture in American politics is the cause, and when that would be in your view and why.
So I, throughout this last 3 years, met a lot of pro-Israel alumni from Columbia. I get the sense that problems started around like 15, 20 years ago, but I can't really pinpoint. Obviously, when I arrived at Columbia, it was already very, very bad. And I'll address the second question, which I think is super, super important. The key word these days on campus is intersectionality. For those of you who are not familiar with this horrible term, it means that groups like Students for Justice in Palestine go to, for example, the Native American group, and they tell them, you know, you are like the Palestinians and the Israelis are like the Americans who are kicking the Native Americans out of their houses. So now you need to join us. And they are all and they go, it goes to like ridiculous places. For example, they would go to the LGBTQIA plus group and say, you know, Israel is like the people who are oppressing you, and the Palestinians are like you, being denied their rights. So now you need to join us. And they never would mention that, you know, LGBTQIA plus people are being thrown off the roofs in Gaza, because that doesn't fit the narrative. And unfortunately, people today on college campuses, which was very disappointing to me to find out, because I thought people at Columbia are very smart and wise people, but they don't do their research and they just take that for granted and they believe that because it's easy to believe that. First of all, you know, when you don't know the facts, it makes sense. And second of all, because you have this strong and weak dichotomy, and the strong is necessarily the evil and the weak is necessarily the poor one. and the good one. So they believe that. And second of all, it's just very, very cool these days to be anti-Israel. In that bundle of intersectionality, if you want to be progressive and woke and to some extent popular, you have to adopt a certain set of beliefs, which being anti-Israel is unfortunately one of them. I think a lot of the pro-Israel activists try to do ourselves some, I don't want to be mean. I would just say that we're sometimes underestimating how central the anti-Israel element is to this bundle of wokeness. We try to say, no, they just managed to somehow push it in. No, being anti-Israel is an inherent part of this bundle of being woke and progressive. And we need to understand that. The faster we understand it, the faster we can move towards trying to pull it out of that bundle. But saying to ourselves, no, it's just like a tangent, no, it's not. It's a part of that bundle, and we need to address it as such. And we need to find a way to deconstruct it. So for example, and I know that goes a little beyond the question, but for example, what we do in SSI, for example, we hosted an LGBTQIA plus panel of Zionists, one transgender Zionist, one gay Zionist, and one lesbian Zionist, to speak about how Zionism empowers them in their activism. We hosted a panel of indigenous peoples from the Middle East. We had a Kurd, a Yazidi, and an Syrian speak about how they view Zionism as an inspiration, advocating for their communities. And these are the sort of things that are trying to break this, to kind of detach anti-Zionism from this bundle of social wokeness.
I think it's such a good point about the centrality of anti-Israel and this ideology, and it really reminds me that something that I noticed a while ago, and I forget occasionally, that I think the sort of far left trends that have been in Europe for a very, very long time are becoming center stage in America in a way that they weren't before. And I think it's long been the case in Europe that this sort of thing happens, right? So just a very brief anecdote, that I was with my wife in Italy, in Rome, and there was this far left demonstration, and like there was sort of it was like the Italian Communist Party or something. They had like Communist Party flags and whatever, they're waving them, and I asked someone who spoke English, like, what's the thing? And it was some kind of demonstration for workers' rights. It was some very clear left-wing cause, and I said to my wife, who's Israeli and who grew up in Israel and didn't have my experiences in London, and I said, wait for the Palestinian flag. And she said, why would there be a Palestinian flag? And I said, just wait for the Palestinian flag. So we waited for like about 10 minutes, and lo and behold, there was a big Palestinian flag sort of held up at this. And I see this now in America, and it's sort of it's very indicative of the direction things are going, unfortunately. And I think you can see it with people like AOC, right? With Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, very, very prominent left-wing Democratic Congresswoman who my guess is knows very, very little about the Middle East generally, because she's focused on domestic issues in New York, and yet she's adopted the anti-Israel thing because she knows that's what you have to do. That's part of the agenda that she's signed up to. And I think that's very...
Well, you don't even have to guess. She said it herself. One of the first interviews she gave on television, she said she defined what Israel is doing in Gaza as massacre. And when the journalist asked her, based on what are you saying this? This is a very big allegation. She said, you know what, I'm not an expert in geopolitics, but now I have a time to learn. So I think that's the epitome of what I'm experiencing on campus. The fact that student government at Columbia is debating whether or not Israel is an apartheid state and needs to be boycotted is ridiculous. These are 40, 18 to 20-year-old Americans who have never been to Israel, who at best read one article about Israel in the New York Times and shared it on their Facebook page. And they are sitting there for 4.5 hours, and I need to explain why to not boycott my country. I mean, that's ridiculous, because everyone in the US now feels like they're an expert. And, it's kind of this new trend that everyone can do and say whatever they want without having, any and no repercussions to what you're saying.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely right. And one of the big problems we face. Maybe you could respond to this suggestion from Karen Pisk, who says, why don't you put up posters of Arabs and Jews together in Israel and write, "This is apartheid"? Question mark. This is apartheid, or hospitals featuring treatments of Arabs, or I guess you could have Arab, any number of scenarios, I guess, where there would be Arabs and Jews together.
Karen, I think that we have a very similar mind. During Hebrew Liberation Week, we do exactly that. There is a great photographer in Israel called Sharon Gabay. He photographs mainly in Jerusalem, and he gave us access to all his pictures for free, which is amazing, and it's a good time to say thank you again. And he photographs a lot of these scenarios in Israel where Arabs and Jews are riding the metro train together or walking the streets together. Pictures of IDF soldiers guarding Arab villages. And these are the sort of things that we printed out on our huge displays for Hebrew Liberation Week. So yeah.
Okay. Maybe we'll have one last question from Yitzhak, who asks, he says that you expected to find anti-Zionism at Columbia, but you weren't expecting anti-Semitism. And then you went on to say that then you discovered that there's a very fine line between the two, or there's no difference. So he asks, can you please describe specifically anti-Semitism, or what you would define as anti-Semitism?
Okay, so I think there's a few ways in which anti-Semitism manifests itself at Columbia. There is the very in-your-face kind of anti-Semitism. For example, a week after the BDS referendum passed at Columbia, they found a huge swastika on the library. That's an in-your-face anti-Semitism. A swastika being painted on college walk, that's in your face. There's more subtle ways. Subtle ways are professors teaching in class, a fatwa by bin Laden saying how it's permissible and even mandatory to kill all Jews. And they never say, that's not okay. That's a horrible person who wrote this, and we only learn it because, this is a class about bin Laden. No, they would say, read this and never address it again. That's a different kind, which is extremely problematic in my opinion. Another type is professors who teach, books that contain anti-Semitic tropes. But also other things. For example, students, the last apartheid week, the official flyer Students for Justice in Palestine put up had a Jewish soldiers with horns. I mean, there's not many ways in which you can interpret two red triangles going out of someone's head. They try to say it's not anti-Semitism, but there's not many interpretations to that. And then there's what I see is perhaps the most problematic part. Columbia believes in the freedom of speech on steroids. Okay, they hosted Ahmadinejad when he was president of Iran in a notorious lecture in which obviously he talked about destroying Israel, but he also said the unforgettable sentence, there is no gays in Iran. So it's not just about Jews, it's about being bigoted in general. But just a little before COVID started, Columbia invited Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, who calls himself a proud anti-Semite on his blog. And he said things like Jews react instinctively to money and other horrible claims like that. And it's so problematic because Colombia is inviting him. He spoke at the Global Leaders Forum, which is Colombia's most respected summit throughout the year, in which princes and heads of states are coming to speak, and they host this person who, he calls himself an anti-Semite. I don't think you shouldn't say more than that. And that's a very problematic thing because it normalizes it. I think it is important to address that specific instance for a second. So what SSI did with the Mahathir Mohamad event is that, first of all, as soon as we saw it, we sent an email to the president of Colombia saying, look, this is outrageous. You are completely disregarding the Jewish community and you're making us feel very, very unsafe. And we demanded that Dr. Mohamad be called out on stage for being an anti-Semite. And I remember someone said it before. I know someone asked before if we get support from the administration. I know it's a bold request. I mean, I sent it in my own private email, a junior at Columbia, asking the president of Columbia to call the head of state of Malaysia an anti-Semite on stage, but it was done. And I don't think it would have been done if we didn't send that email. I mean, I know it's because of that, because because Bollinger, the president, replied to my email and said, "You're right, we're going to do that." So that's firstly very, very important. And then we went into the lecture hall and left on every single chair a flyer with all the anti-Semitic statements Dr. Mohamad made. So everyone who's listening to the speech will know what kind of person they're listening to. And then my last sentence, amazing Vice President Romy Ronen went there, and mind you, she is a 19-year-old American girl, and she marched in there, picked up the mic, and said, "You're an anti-Semite, and I want you to explain to us how can you come here to New York and say these outrageous anti-Semitic comments," which is, I'm not sure anyone would have the guts to do. And I'm extremely proud of her for that. But yeah, that's what we're trying to do. And I do feel like the administration is taking it seriously more and more recently, and specifically since a new dean at the School of General Studies assumed office, and she's very attentive to our concerns.
Okay. I said that was the last question. I do want to ask, just Mark Goldberg asks how you're funded.
That's a very good question.
Because it maybe people.
That's a good way to conclude. So first of all, people ask me that a lot. We do not get money from the State of Israel. We do not want to get money from the State of Israel. We want to be independent and do what we believe. There are a lot of good people who donate money to our cause, and they can do it if they are on this call, going on to www.ssimovement.org. And there's a very big, I think, blue donate button on the website. So if you can, every dollar counts. That would be very helpful. And if you're interested in donating specifically to the Columbia chapter, I linked my email in the chat. You can reach out to me and we will do that.
Okay, fantastic. Mark Goldberg, who asked that question about the funding, also said amazing work.
Thank you.
Which I think he speaks for everyone on this call. Personally, as I said, before I encountered you, I was familiar with SSI and with Ilan and Valeria, who started it, and I think they do incredible.
Paul is being very modest. He gave a few very good lectures in SSI webinars in the past.
Thank you very much. I'm British, it's part of the deal. But SSI does amazing work generally, and I would definitely recommend go on the website ssimovement.org as Ophir says, and if you're able to donate. But even if you're not able to donate, check out what they do, look at the amazing videos that are on there and the events that they have.
I'll just say one more thing.
Sure.
If you're interested specifically, I know there's a lot of Columbia alumni on this call. If you're interested in what we're doing at Columbia, we have a monthly newsletter in which we update on all our events. And we also send invitations via email to all our open to the public events. So if you're interested in being on that mailing list and getting updates and invitations to our events, again, my email is in the chat. Send me your email address and I'll add you and you'll be updated. Okay,
so Ophir has written her email address and her Twitter and Facebook on the chat. You can also email me and get that from me if you miss it here. So you can get in touch with Ophir that way. So yeah, I want to thank Ophir again. It's been a fabulous talk.
Thank you.
I can't quite believe that you're 26. It's terrifying.
Me neither. I know. I'm so old.
Yeah, very funny. But yeah, you're by some distance, I think, the youngest guest speaker that we've had on this program of lectures and discussions. But you're also one of the best we've had. So thank you very, very much. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're back next week as usual. Email me if you're not on the mailing list. I just wrote down my email on the chat. No, actually, I actually wrote it to someone privately by mistake. I'm going to write it to everyone in a second. But it's paulg@begincenter.org.il. And I also want to tell you that the Begin Center is running a new course of 4 lectures about Jerusalem in partnership with a very exciting young Jewish organization called the Jerusalem Parliament, which is a network of entrepreneurs and young politicians and activists